I turned a pile of plywood into this kitchen, and I saved a lot of money doing it. So if you want to know how to build kitchen cabinets from start to finish, then stick around. I'll walk you through every step. There's a few different parts to kitchen cabinets, but before we can build any of those, we have to start by cutting our pieces.
To cut my pieces, I used a combination of my table saw and my Ryobi circular saw with a Kreg AccuCut jig. This jig is a really good option if you don't have the budget to buy a track saw. This thing only costs about 80 bucks and it lets you basically use your circular saw like it's a track saw. It doesn't have all of the features of a track saw, like being able to plunge cut, but that's a really small sacrifice given the price tag. And if you use a blade with a high enough tooth count, you can come out with almost no tear out. The table saw I had at the time I built these cabinets was a really budget-friendly option. It was only about 300 bucks brand new with the stand. So it doesn't have a really high rip capacity or a large table, so needless to say, I used the Kreg AccuCut jig for all the large pieces, and all of the smaller pieces like supports in the cabinet carcasses, stuff like that, I used the table saw for. As many of you guys already know, 3/4 inch plywood isn't actually a full 3/4 of an inch. It's a little bit thinner. So when you're trying to measure the length of pieces and you're taking that into account, it can kind of be a pain to get everything as precise as you want it. And that's where these Milescraft fence clamps come into play. You just need to cut 2 strips about the same width and height of your fence and then bore 2 holes into one of the pieces. Then you can insert those clamps into those holes and clamp them onto your fence. This is going to create a sacrificial fence, but we're actually not going to be cutting into it. What we're going to be doing is using it to get precise cuts. So let's say, for example, that you need to cut a piece that is 12 inches minus the thickness of 2 pieces of plywood. Well, all you have to do is set your fence to 12 inches, add that sacrificial fence, and voila, all of your cuts are going to be 12 inches minus the thickness of 2 pieces of plywood. To cut out the toe kick, I'm just using a speed square to draw a 4 inch by 4 inch square in the corner, and then I'm going to cut that out with a circular saw. A jigsaw is a fantastic tool for this as well, but I ran out of blades, so I used my circular saw and a pull saw to finish it off. Is anybody else with me that sometimes you just reach for a handsaw before you reach for a power saw? It's just like a return to your roots thing, right? Anyway, let's get back to it. So the next thing that I did was run a 1/4 inch groove in the back of all the cabinet carcass pieces. This groove is going to be what accepts the floating back panel. To build these shaker style doors, I'm using a Frood adjustable tongue and groove router bit. So instead of cutting these dados on the table saw, which would require 2 passes, I just used this bit and it went way faster. Then I went back to the table saw to cut out the back panels. And for the shelves in the cabinet, I'm just cutting some 3/4 inch plywood to size and painting it. I'm not doing any edge banding.
Now that we have our pieces cut, the first thing to assemble is the cabinet carcass.
My lowers are all composed of 2 back pieces, a bottom piece, 4 support stretchers, a toe kick, and a back panel. And to assemble these cabinets, I'm using a combination of glue, brad nails, and, you guessed it, pocket hole screws. So after putting pocket holes in all of the pieces, it was then time to assemble. Assembly started by adding a bead of glue all along where the bottom piece touches both side panels. Now I'm going to lift the pieces up into position and then we're going to fasten them together. First, I'm going to sink some 18 gauge brad nails in just to hold everything tight, and then I'm going to come back with pocket hole screws. The brad nails aren't necessary, you could just clamp it together. In fact, that's what I did for a lot of the time, but with these larger, easier pieces, I just brad nailed them together and then pocket screwed them. Having the nail holes really didn't matter to me because at the end of the day, these cabinets are getting painted. So any nail holes that I had, I just used some wood filler, and then when I sanded and painted, they were non-existent. So now that we have those panels attached, we can turn this thing around and start adding the rest. Next up is adding the back panel, and I don't know what it was, but during this project, I just wasn't able to cut a back panel to the proper size on the first try. Almost every single back panel I had to cut twice. So That's what I did with this one. I took it back to the table saw, ripped about a 1/2 inch off, and it fit perfectly. Next, I added a stretcher piece above the back panel to hold that in place, and then I clamped it down, threw some nails in it, and then pocket screwed. Oh, but of course, I'm checking for square first. Always check for square. All right, Clayton, that's enough. You've already checked it like 16 times. It's square. So anyway, then I went on to attach the front stretcher piece and the top and bottom stretcher pieces in the back. Then I installed the toe kick the same exact way. Glue in brad nails in the front and pocket holes in the back. And that is a complete cabinet carcass ready for a face frame. Wait, no, don't reach for a square. Man, how many times do I have to check if it's square? Goodness, I need to just trust myself more. Building these corner cabinets was a 1 out of 10 do not recommend. If I were to build another set of kitchen cabinets, I would not make the corner cabinet a 45-degree angle. I would just make it square. It would be so much easier to build it that way because almost every single measurement was different, contrasted to all of my other cabinets, which everything was the same. Everything worked out great in the end and it's an awesome cabinet, but it was a total pain. And it has practically the same exact construction as all of the other lowers, just at a 45-degree angle. I'm not going to show you how I built every single cabinet carcass because honestly, that would take way too long. So instead, I'm going to show you 4 or 5 of them of various sizes and shapes, just so that you can see that they're all built almost exactly the same way, just with different dimensions.
Next, we're going to drill some holes for the shelf pins.
If you haven't caught on yet, I'll say the quiet part out loud. Craig makes cheap jigs for almost anything, so here I am using a shelf pin jig, and you just drill a hole, you stick the jig in that hole to reference, and then you drill the rest. So it basically lets you do all of the holes really fast.
Now that we have the carcasses finished up, we have to build and attach the face frames.
To make the face frames, I'm using 3/4 inch maple. Maple is a really good hardwood, so it's going to be great for things like face frames or cabinet doors. And that's why I used it. You can also buy this pre-milled to final dimension at a local hardwood supplier. And to attach the face frame pieces together, we're going to be using glue and pocket screws. Now we aren't going to be using brad nails on this as well because it's just really not feasible at this angle. So make sure that you clamp everything down nice and tight and get everything as flush and even as possible. Then just drive home all 8 pocket screws until you have a completed face frame. It honestly is that easy. In fact, I really enjoyed building these face frames because of the simplicity of it. It didn't require a lot of brain power. They were really simple measurements, and working with this maple was really nice. A lot of people use pocket screws to attach face frames, but in this case it's really not super necessary since we're going to be painting these. So I really don't care if I'm throwing a ton of holes in the front. So what I just do is lay down a bead of glue and then come back with the brad nailer and nail it down in place. It was really easy to build these face frames. It only took me about 20 minutes per cabinet to do.
Now let's build all the drawers for the kitchen.
Cutting all of the pieces for the drawers is really straightforward. Just follow all of the steps I showed at the beginning of this video. And don't forget to route a dado in the bottom of all of the drawer pieces so that we could slide in our bottom panel. And that is a nice fit. This is one of the smaller drawers in the kitchen, but it's the same exact concept for all of them. To install the drawer slides, I first added some spacers to the sides of the cabinets so that the drawer slides would sit level and flush. Then I attached the larger part to the cabinet carcass and the smaller part of the drawer slide to the sides of the drawers. And man, am I a fan of those soft close hinges.
And the last big part of building these cabinets is making the cabinet doors and drawer faces.
Now we're finally going to use that fruit bit set for what it's intended for, which is to make shaker style doors. You'll use the groove bit first to cut a groove in both the rails and stiles, then you use the other bit to cut a tenon on the rails. Then we're going to add glue to the groove and to the tenons, and we're going to assemble everything together. If your panel is made out of solid wood, then I definitely don't recommend gluing it in place. But since I'm using a plywood, I can safely glue mine in place and it's not going to go anywhere. The seasonal wood movement is not going to be nearly as much with plywood as it would be with a solid wood. You don't need to use any sort of metal fastener when you're assembling these shaker style doors. We're not using nails, we're not using screws. If you use the router bit properly, it's going to make a really tight fit. So all you have to do is add glue and throw it in clamps. And just give it a nice even pressure. Don't squeeze the crap out of it. It'll bend.
And the last thing to do to finish these cabinets off was to fill all of the cracks and holes with wood filler, then sand everything smooth, and move on to painting them.
I first used a block plane to flush up the face frames with the sides of the cabinets. Then I sanded them to 220 grit and then broke all of the edges by hand with more 220 grit sandpaper. It is worth mentioning that kitchen cabinets are often built with the face frames overhanging the sides about 3/8 of an inch, and that's to help with alignment when you're installing them. This is not a steadfast rule. At the end of the day, it's your cabinets, build them how you want, and so I chose not to do that for simplicity's sake. The painting process was fairly simple. I started with one coat of a high quality primer, and then I did 2 coats of cabinet door and trim enamel by Behr. As you can see, I sprayed on the paint and I'm using my Wagner Flexio sprayer, which I've really grown to love. It's really easy to refill and it really holds and puts down a lot of paint. And yes, I know I'm painting on the ground like an 8th century barbarian, but I didn't have time to go get stands, okay?
Now that all the painting and the flooring is done in the apartment, I could finally move on to installing these cabinets, which have been sitting in my shop for quite a few months, considering I actually built them before I finished the basement. So with the countertop people coming in just a couple days, I had to move on and install these cabinets.
You're definitely going to want some help when installing cabinets so somebody can hold them up while you screw it in place or vice versa. Start with the uppers so that you have room to work, and then once those are in, you can put in the lowers. To attach these to the wall, I'm using 3-inch GRK cabinet screws. They have a really large head and they're also self-pre-drilling. And attaching the lowers was very much the same thing, but a lot easier since we didn't have to carry them over our heads. We just put them in place and then attach them to the studs. As you can see with the masking on the wall, I had to do a little bit of touch-up paint because there were a couple cabinets where I accidentally didn't paint the sides, or some places I just needed to touch up in general. But with that done, I installed all of the doors, drawers, and shelves and got everything looking good. If you're going to be building any cabinets, I recommend going with soft close drawer slides. They really add a nice feel, and they're also very cheap to purchase. They're not much more expensive than their non-soft close counterparts. Then I put on all of the drawer pulls, and this kitchen was done.
So here's the cost breakdown of what I spent building the kitchen. I spent $600 on 3/4 inch plywood, $200 on 1/4 inch plywood, $520 on the face frames, $150 on the paint, $75 on the router bit, $87 on the hinges, and $50 on the slides. So in total, this came out to $1,682. I had a few other things to buy, like a router table and some sandpaper and some other miscellaneous things like that. So my cost actually came closer to $2,000, but if you already have those things, then you won't have to buy them. I also priced out the option of purchasing cabinets. And the cheapest cabinets that I could find were about $4,500 for these exact same dimensions, plus about $400 to $500 to ship them to me, making that around a $5,000 investment plus some taxes. Now, I did save about $3,000 by building these cabinets myself, but there is more to it than that. The cabinets I would have gotten if I purchased them would have been made out of 1/2-inch particle board with MDF face frames and the cheapest drawer slides and hinges imaginable. But the cabinets that I ended up with were made out of 3/4 inch plywood, solid maple face frames, and they had soft close, full extension drawer slides and soft close hinges. So in addition to saving $3,000 building these myself, I also have some really sturdy cabinets that are never gonna break, which is gonna be especially good given the fact that they're in a rental unit. If you thought this video wasn't terrible, make sure to get subscribed because I make lots of videos that aren't terrible. In fact, this video was the last of around 10 videos that I did finishing my basement into a rental. So here's a link to the full build video if you wanna see that. I'm Clayton, the Weekend Builder, and I'll catch you in the next one.